观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。2021年，中国国家主席习近平提出了东升西降的口号，表明中国预计将取代美国成为世界领先的经济强国。在那一年，中国通过强硬手段，在很大程度上抑制了新冠病毒的流行，并且继续创下10年来最快的经济增长。而同一年，美国则在新冠的反复爆发和通货膨胀的飙升中苦苦挣扎。2021年秋天的亚太峰会上，习近平与拜登举行了视频峰会。当时，习近平被推崇为中国这一代人中最有权势的领导人，而拜登则生活在川普失败的政策留下的阴影之下。而2年之后的今天，本周三，习近平与拜登又再一次在亚太峰会上碰面。时过境迁，今年再看习近平2021年关于东升西降的言论，似乎无法再令人信服。中国经济正面临众多挑战，从房地产泡沫的破灭、地方政府债务难以控制，到信心下滑和通货紧缩。与此同时，美国则刚刚录得近2年来最强劲的季度表现，通胀也有所消退。2021年，中国的国内生产总值为美国的75%，今年第3季度已经下滑至64%，退回到了2017年的水平。短短2年，中国发生了什么？中国并没有突然改变方向，西方专家得出的结论是，中国长期恶化的问题浮出水面，而习近平的政策令这些问题变得更加严重。中国并没有真正意义上的衰落，但是其引领全球经济的愿景已经受到打击，甚至可能无望再实现。荣鼎集团中国市场研究总监洛根赖特表示，北京永远无法宣称自己是全球经济的主导者了。他认为中国的 GDP 可能有一天会达到美国的90%甚至100%，但是超过美国的可能性并不存在。美国相对国内生产总值最近因为通胀上升和中国货币贬值而得到提振。然而，《华尔街日报》指出，美国现在就说必胜和2021年习近平说必胜一样为时过早。从近期来看，美国的消费可能会放缓，而中国的经济增长似乎已经逐渐稳定下来。在未来10年，中国的经济增长仍将超过美国。但重要的是，尽管中国经济多达3/4的领域都面临逆风，但是制造业这1/4的领域不会面临逆风。在可预见的未来，即使整体增长乏力，中国仍将是西方的经济和军事威胁。而中国现在的问题是放缓幅度超出预期。从1980年到2012年，中国的年均增长率为10%，但是由于人口老龄化、农村人口向城市迁移的减少，以及追赶富裕国家的机会减少，中国的经济增长在目前阶段必然会放缓，但放缓程度超出预期。世界银行目前预计中国未来2年的年均增长率为4.5%，比10年前的预测低了1个百分点。而国际货币基金组织预计中国未来5年平均增长率仅为3.9%。长期以来，中国经济增长的动力来自于投资，而美国经济增长的动力则来自于消费。这导致之前还出现了一些漫画认为是中国人高瞻远瞩，美国人目光短浅。但是在过去10年中，中国这种靠投资的发展模式走向了过度化。在2007年到2009年全球金融危机期间，中国推出了大规模的经济刺激计划，主要针对基础设施、房地产以及后来的技术领域。地方政府和开发商通过向银行和中国公众借款，利用新的融资工具规避中国政府施加的借款限制，为这些投资提供了资金。经济学家表示，2010年至2021年，中国住宅建设面积几乎翻了一番，人均超过38平方米，与英国和法国差不多，是日本的2倍。相比之下，美国的房屋和基础设施太少，而中国是两者都太多。中国有数百万套公寓空置，贵州这样一个相对贫穷的省份，却拥有着世界上最高的100座桥梁中的23座。中国高速铁路轨道的增长速度也是乘客增长速度的2倍多。今天，开发商和地方政府用于投融资的大部分债务都面临违约的风险。国际货币基金组织预计， 中国30%的地方政府债务无法偿还。土地出让金和营业税收入的崩溃使地方政府面临着巨额赤字。洛根赖特认为，中国的财政空间比人们认为的要小得多，已经无法为工业政策、国防以及“一带一路”的外国基础设施贷款提供充足的资金。中国专制制度的好处之一是能够果断行动，不受民主制衡的约束。然而，北京方面尚未对地方债务和银行不良贷款采取果断行动，将其转移到中央政府相对健康的资产负债表上。相反，北京正试图重组地方债务。他最近宣布将借出相当于 GDP 0.8% 的资金来支持地方政府的财政，但是这实际上只满足了地方政府需求的一小部分。这可能令中国陷入类似于20世纪90年代日本那样的多年金融泥潭。而相比之下，当2007年到2008年美国房地产泡沫崩溃的时候，美国联邦政府迅速动员起来，对银行系统进行了资本的重组。另外，与房地产泡沫一样，中国的人口下降也是一个缓慢发展的问题，但是在过去2年突然加速。2017年，中国生育率约为 1.6， 低于维持人口稳定所需的 2.1。取消一胎政策后，北京原本预计2020年至2030年生育率将会升至 1.8 左右，但是一项研究显示，生育率却继续下降，去年已经降至 1.1， 是世界上生育率最低的国家之一。原因是多方面的，而一些分析人士也将此归咎于育龄妇女对经济的悲观情绪不断加深。去年中国人口出现了自20世纪60年代以来的首次下降。中国的财产和人口问题会相互影响。美国能够通过人口和移民的增长来摆脱2000年代中期的住房过剩，而中国则由于人口减少和外国移民几乎不存在，而面临结构性的需求下降。中国需要新的需求来源来接替投资和房地产，最明显的候选者是通过消费，但是中国消费者的贡献仅占 GDP 的 37%， 而美国这一比例为 68%。与此同时，习近平通过一系列影响深远的政策，又阻碍了中国的经济复苏。加州大学的中国产业政策专家巴里诺顿表示，从2020年开始，中国共产党对阿里巴巴、在线教育和游戏领域的私营企业展开了监管打压，表面上是为了打击垄断行为和保护消费者隐私，但主要是为了巩固党对私营部门的控制。诺顿表示，这些政策除了摧毁了大约1万亿美元的财富之外，习近平还发出了一个更为广泛的信号，那就是他不喜欢私营企业，不在乎他们的价值被破坏。习近平推动产业自给自足，以及在地缘政治方面的好战，进一步削弱了中国的经济前景，促使美国和欧盟通过限制与中国在战略领域的贸易和投资来降低风险。国际货币基金组织的一项研究发现，自2010年以来，外国投资越来越多地在同一地缘政治集团的国家之间流动，因此2022年中国在战略领域获得的外国直接投资比2015年减少了 60%， 而美国则增加了 43%。全球化对中国的帮助要大于西方，因为中国有更大的追赶空间，而去全球化则会对中国造成更大的伤害。国际货币基金组织的另一项研究模拟了这样一种场景：经合组织的国家如果与中国脱钩，而所有其他国家都与他们倾向的集团保持一致，那么10年之后，美国的经济损失仅为 GDP 的 0.3%， 而中国损失则为 GDP 的 4%。另外，中国创业活力衰退的迹象也随处可见。中国的风险投资领域曾经一度与美国相媲美，但是数据显示，今年的风投交易量从2018年美国的 85% 缩减至美国的 32%。许多中国企业家已经离开或者正在试图离开中国，很多前往了新加坡。但是也许这并不会让习近平感到十分痛苦，因为他希望中国不是靠私营部门来决定哪些行业应该获得资本。中国的中央和地方政府设立了2000多个政府引导基金，向北京认为的重点领域投资了数万亿美元。但随着宽松信贷的枯竭和地方财政的恶化，习近平的雄心面临着风险。经济学家表示，由于地方债务负担、监管收紧和其他经济阻力，政府指导基金筹集的资金始终低于目标。去年的筹款额较2021年下降了 35%。 然而，尽管中国面临着人口、财政和金融方面的压力，但是中国巨大的制造业并没有出现衰退，恰恰相反，今年中国取代日本成为全球最大的汽车出口国。中国品牌可能不如西方的顶级品牌，但是它们已经足够好，而且价格便宜，因此正在全球范围内赢得市场份额。迄今为止，美国阻碍了中国制造最先进半导体的能力。然而，半导体行业组织估计，到2026年，中国将会控制全球42%的低先进芯片的产能，而这些芯片对于家电和汽车等应用至关重要。也就是说，习近平对更广泛的经济管理虽然不善，但是中国的制造业实力将可以继续依靠固有的竞争优势而持续存在，包括中国庞大的生产者基础、可靠且工资适中的劳动力和管理知识，这些为中国提供了影响全球的重要渠道。彼得森国际经济研究所的经济学家表示，尽管拜登政府试图通过其印太经济框架拉近与亚洲经济体的距离，但是这些经济体却与中国供应链的关系越来越紧密。例如，美国正在拉拢印度以制衡中国，但是中国在印度进口中的份额已经从2010年的27%飙升至2021年的39%。中国的制造实力也是一项强大的军事资产。中国庞大的现代化造船厂已经建造了世界上46%的船舶，使其能够每年生产数艘新的军舰和潜艇。而相比之下，美国造船业产能还不到世界的1%，这使得美国海军只能够依赖少数的造船厂，而这些造船厂缺乏必要的劳动力，交货始终延迟且超出预算。耶鲁大学法学院的学者王丹撰写了大量有关中国科技产业的文章，他表示，美国主要在人工智能和生物技术等知识密集型领域取得领先，而不是在实体产品领域取得领先。美国最近才意识到这一缺陷。拜登政府正在向电动汽车和半导体等目标行业提供大量补贴和保护，这导致美国工厂建设激增，但是目前尚不清楚需求能否令这些工厂实际产生利益。此外，美国还试图拉拢盟友一致行动，比如美国和欧洲一直在努力就投资中国方面达成一致，但是专家表示这是一种非常脆弱的纽带，比如明年秋天川普可能成为美国总统的前景就将成为西方盟友的担忧之一。川普在上一任期内退出了12国跨太平洋伙伴关系协定，还对盟友征收钢铁和铝的关税，并且威胁对汽车征收同样的关税。卸任之后，川普还提议对所有进口产品征收10%的关税，并且暗示要退出北约。柏林中国研究中心的主任霍塔利表示，欧洲的预期是，如果川普回来，他在向欧洲施压方面会做得更加的充分，更加的老练，而中国将可以利用由此造成的分裂，对任何摇摆不定的美国盟友进行经济方面的诱惑。面对新晋孤立主义抬头的美国和支持乌克兰的重担，德国可能会重新转向中国，因为它无力与所有人作战。也就是说，如果美国在西方联盟中的经济和军事方面的领头作用不再存在，那么习近平关于西方衰落的预言也有可能就会实现了。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道，我们下期节目再见。
Well, you have put Australia-U.S. relations in very good shape, and I presume that means that it's allowed you plenty of time to continue to examine developments in China, an area of great expertise for you. And I've been reading a lot about significant economic headwinds in China, about youth unemployment, and also about sort of palace politics, purges, and other of these sort of mysterious doings of Leninist authoritarian systems. Can you help us look behind the curtain and just give us a sense from your perspective, based on your long efforts looking at China, what's going on in China? What's the state of the union in the People's Republic?
Well, we've been asking that question for about 50 years about the PRC, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. So, and these are kind of my personal reflections. I don't reflect any considered analytical view on behalf of the Australian government. But I do read the stuff. You know, I read their official literature and I follow the debates, and we talk to people when they are travelling to the United States out of China. So putting all this together is sometimes complex. I think in terms of the core question of the economy, and we should probably start there, the fact that growth has been slowing now for so long is not an accident. It's not the product of you know, a hard landing post-COVID. It's not the product exclusively of external economic factors like declining trade and declining foreign capital flows. It largely comes from conscious ideological decisions within the Chinese system by Xi Jinping himself to move more to the Marxist left over the last 5 years or so. And you trace this back to the 19th Party Congress in 2017. You see this series of statements which says we want to reprioritise the role of state and enterprises. We want to put new constraints around the role of private firms, and not just Jack Ma and Alibaba, but a whole bunch of them. We want to begin to implement a doctrine of common prosperity, which is about income redistribution. We want to think more carefully about how much we are taxing corporates. And you put all that together, that the flow-through effect that it's had on business and consumer confidence over 5 years or so has been quite negative. And these things tend to build on each other, and these are the constituent elements, I think, of a much slower period of economic growth. I think the other thing to be said is that in the modern history of the Chinese Communist Party, the social contract between party and people has always rested on growth of around about 6%. That's been historically calculated as the benchmark through which you generate enough increased economic activity to continue to liberate people from poverty, continue to increase living standards, and overall contribute to a better quality of life. And that has been an enormously stabilising thing for 35 years until it wasn't. And you've seen that start to unravel in part as well. That brings us to the present, and I'll come to politics in 1 second. So I think in the back of the mind of President Xi Jinping as he comes to San Francisco this week for the APEC summit, together with his bilateral summit with President Biden, how to kickstart China's economic growth is actually in the forefront of his mind. On pure politics, the other part of your question, Danny, the way in which I would see it is that notwithstanding recent purges of Qin Gang, the former foreign minister, and of Li Shangfu, the former defence minister, and of the so-called Second Artillery, which is the rocket force within the PLA, allegedly on grounds of corruption. These sorts of purges actually have been going on for the last 10 years at one level or another through the agency of the anti-corruption campaign. So when people ask, therefore, when people, I think, too rapidly conclude, therefore, that Xi Jinping leadership's in trouble, I think that is a wrong conclusion. It's the Marxist-Leninist state which controls power through the security apparatus, the intelligence apparatus, and the folks who are able to be the enforcers of the system. And I see no evidence that that's unravelling. Are people underneath it all unhappier than before? You certainly sense that in the wider body politic and the wider economic community and the entrepreneurial community. But to conclude from the above that therefore Xi Jinping's leadership is somehow tottering, I think that's a false conclusion. So I think that's the kind of environment we'll be confronting, the President of the United States will be confronting and other leaders when they meet with Xi Jinping this week.
Would you agree that there's been a steady shift in the direction of comprehensive security that has impacted economic policies, certainly in the sense that, first and foremost, we saw in the crackdown on big tech platforms that Xi Jinping and the party leadership was just not going to tolerate a competing center of power. And secondly, that he seemed not to want the cream of China's youth wasting its time and brain cells on frivolous things like consumer products and online games, and instead they should be building hypersonic missiles and advancing artificial intelligence in support of the nation and the military.
And studying Xi Jinping thought on the weekends.
Yeah.
And
if only there was an app.
That's right, and you don't even have TikTok there. And so, yeah, I mean, the securitization of everything is a core part of what Xi Jinping would describe as his new development concept. Language matters a lot in the Chinese political system because it's a Marxist-Leninist system, and they communicate much, but not all, through the code language of ideological formulations. So, everyone here remembers the period of reform and opening, Deng Xiaoping. You couldn't have any Chinese leader on this stage from the time of the beginning of the reform period in '78 through until 2012 without the words reform and opening, reform and opening, reform and opening being the central organising principles of the mantra. And they meant something. What do they mean? They meant that we will now submit the allocation of resources in the domestic market, the Chinese economy, increasingly to market forces to distribute rather than the state. And opening was the code language for, and we'll submit ourselves to the disciplines of the international market as well, which means that we'll sell as much as we can, we'll import as much as we can, and that will introduce new efficiencies into the Chinese economy. That was kind of the mantra, what was the mantra for 35 years. Again, I go back to the 19th Party Congress, which is where I see so many of these origin points as lying, including on security. When you look inside the entrails of the 19th Party Congress, it proclaims a couple of things. We're now into a new era, 新时代. Secondly, this new era actually comes after the reform and opening period. Thirdly, the economic strategy is no longer reform and opening. It is called the New Development Concept. And what is the New Development Concept? It's kind of made up of two sets of things. One, the language, pardon the opaque nature of it, one part of the language is something called the dual circulation economy. I'll come back to that in 1 second. And the second is the securitization of development, which is your point. What's the dual circulation economy mean? The dual circulation economy means that we, the Chinese economy, will grow in the future in a manner much more driven by domestic consumer demand, less dependent on international trade, less dependent on international capital flows, and in their assessment also less dependent on public infrastructure investment. And then the relative role of what's called foreign circulation begins to fade away or lessen. In other words, if you unpack it, what it's saying is we in China want to become a much more domestically driven economy in the future, less dependent on the world outside. And by the way, the subtext of that is increasingly nationally, economically self-reliant and less dependent on the international economy because of security. Which then flips into the other concept, which is what you referred to before, which is we, the party, are concerned about our domestic security and our international security. At home, we don't want our data to be within the control of the Alibabas and the Tencents of this world. We want the state to have a much more central role. And internationally, we don't wish to be vulnerable to international technology and international capital markets. And so that explains the new thrust in Chinese industrial policy as well. But the net effect of these two big changes, the dual circulation economy model, the securitization of the economy, all form part of what Xi Jinping calls the new development concept, all of which replaces reform and opening. It's the flow-through effect of these macro changes which send signals through to the marketplace where private entrepreneurs are saying, I'm not sure that's as good for me as it used to be. So what do? You keep your cash under the mattress. What do? You perhaps try to get your cash out of the country. What do? You're going to invest in another project worth 10 years of your savings in the next expansion of your widget factory? Maybe not. I might postpone that. And so when you look at the private fixed capital investment numbers in China, they progressively become worse and worse. So I think this is a big factor, and none of it is by accident. My final point here, Danny, would be Xi Jinping embarked upon this because he was concerned about the private sector having too much power in China, and he's concerned about data being in the hands of the private sector and not the state, and he's concerned about the security of the state, and therefore these things will take priority over previous reform and opening pro-market models.
Well, part of the paradox, I think, in both in the combination of dual circulation and securitization is that part of dual circulation, the dual part was after making China less dependent on the world, to sustain or increase the world's dependence on China as the manufacturer for the world and so on. And that hasn't worked well. China's having more and more difficulty investing abroad, selling abroad, and the securitization drive has led to, if not decoupling, then de-risking and diversification. So where does that leave Xi Jinping right now?
I think if you're looking at China's macroeconomic circumstances, there are these dual sets of problems that you've just referred to. One relates to domestic business and consumer confidence. And because that has been knocked around for the reasons that we've just discussed, and because domestic consumption represents a huge driver of GDP growth, that has a negative wash-through in terms of overall growth numbers. But the second factor, the second drag on growth, is what you've just described. If you look at China's net capital inflow-outflow, if you look at the trade balance, these are historically in much worse shape than they have been in recent history. So therefore, the argument underpinning the dual circulation economy, as you said, which is we, China, will be now more domestically driven, but because we are so huge, the world will need our market. They will therefore sell lots to us and become increasingly dependent on our market, and that's good for China. You can also leverage some foreign policy influence through that. Right. And in terms of capital markets, it's such a big market that we'll have the world's biggest financial institutions take increasing stakes in the Chinese domestic economy. And guess what? Because they become dependent on that, therefore, that also provides a further item of leverage in the international economy. Except decoupling brought all this unstuck, or at least de-risking, leading to decoupling. So I think one of the issues very much in the front of Xi Jinping's mind when he comes to San Francisco is what can he say or do here in the United States, and therefore in a global APEC audience as well, which makes up a huge slice of global activity when you've got Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, Australia and the others all in attendance. What can he say or do to rekindle international investor and trade confidence, even though domestic confidence equation will still be suspended over here for the ideological reasons I referred to before?
That's an incredibly important question. And I want to come back to it, but before we get to San Francisco, let's take a quick detour to Australia. And
it's just over there. Get to the water, and it's two movies and a sleep.
A good sleep, I would say.
A long sleep.
Yeah. So taking advantage of your stature and status Australia's representative, not to mention
right.
former
Good.
Prime Minister.
Yeah, right.
Could you tell us a little bit about Australia, China in 2023? What has been the rhythm of the bilateral relationship, and what has changed in terms of the Chinese side of the equation?
I think it's fair to say that for the previous several years, the bilateral relationship between Australia and China has kind of been in the freezer. And, you open the freezer and there's some stuff up the front of the freezer, which is usually frozen meat. Then there's some stuff behind that, which you forgot to take out, and it's looking a bit bad. And then there's the stuff behind that. That was the Australia-China relationship. And,
is there Vegemite in there somewhere too?
Hey, yeah, we just had our 100th anniversary of Vegemite.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And,
it's all yours.
I've never, in my years at the Asia Society, I never managed to convert anyone to Vegemite.
Yeah, I noticed the gift store still doesn't carry it.
Gift store's not carrying with it. Deborah Eiserman, our chief operating officer, once tried it. I've never seen such a look of Munchian horror on anyone's face. It was like a replication of the Scream, the painting. I've told her that if you liquefy it, you can actually use it to start your car. But there you go. Where do we get to with all that? We were talking about Australia. Anyway, we're back in the freezer. So that's where it was. So the objective of the incoming Labor government in Australia under Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong has been pretty simple, straightforward, quite analogous, I think, to what the Biden administration has been seeking to do, albeit at a much more complex level. And that is to stabilise the Australia-China relationship. And the core element of stability in any relationship is to keep the channels of communication open. So we'd been through this ridiculous period where we hadn't had prime ministerial visits in either direction for about 7 years. And that ministerial level contact between Australian and Chinese government ministers had been frozen for effectively 3 years. And a whole bunch of trade barriers or trade sanctions been imposed as well. And through China's use of coercive measures in response to a proposal by a previous Australian Prime Minister, Mr Morrison, that there should be an independent global inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. All of that happened, so the objective which the new government has had is how do you reopen the arteries of political communication and of more normal commerce. So 18 months later, basically they've achieved that through a whole lot of fairly patient diplomacy. But the interesting thing, if you look at the subtext of it, and people ask, well, what did the Australians give up as a result of this process of stabilisation? They didn't actually. They didn't change any policy posture on anything. AUKUS has continued with bipartisan support as a security measure, which Beijing does not support. The Australian government did not back down on any of the economic coercion measures, took the Chinese government to the WTO disputes resolution processes. The Chinese subsequently indicated that they'd like to now review these bans. And at least one arrested Australian citizen who's been a journalist, Chung Lei, has now been returned to Australia. So these as concrete steps in stabilisation, I think, have been useful. Does it mean that the relationship has been completely normalised? That's a separate question.
But Kevin, if the main shift on the Australian side, other than the change of government, was better statecraft, but not big concessions on contentious issues, then is it the Chinese side that did the most to sort of drive the thaw? Did they have the greater interest in moving to normalize or to warm up the relationship with Australia?
I think there was a general conclusion in Beijing that Australian governments, be they of the centre-left or centre-right, are unlikely to turn around and say, oh my God, we should have been much nicer. You know, that's kind of not our nature. So, in fact, if you try to tell Australians what to do by the application of coercive pressure, it's likely to have the reverse effect. That's just the way we are. So I think there was a conclusion in Beijing that this ship was not for turning, that is, the Australian government, in terms of any fundamental shift in Australian government policy. So I think that's true. What I think shifted more broadly, however, was Beijing's global calculus, that it had overreached in terms of, let's call it, the age of wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf warrior diplomacy was something we would happily talk about day in, day out a couple of years ago because there were so many examples of it. Mm-hmm. If I was to ask you today what are the current living examples of wolf warrior diplomacy, there aren't many. So if you were to look at that as a question of change in China's foreign policy posture, I think that's a conclusion deep within the system in China, that there'd been an unnecessary alienation by a series of Chinese actions of countries not just in the Indo-Pacific, but countries in Europe and others as well. So I think the stabilisation in Australia was the product, not just of the efforts of the current Australian government, but also of a wider change, I think, in Beijing's assessment of its overall situation in the world, which had not improved and in fact gone in the reverse direction.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think you can apply that same template to the relationship with the U.S. in the sense, this notion of global recalibration of their messaging and their tone. I mean, one thing that's so striking to me on the Chinese side is the shift over the course of 2023 in language from what at one point we were hearing from State Council or Director Wang Yi and others, to the effect that China can't be expected to cooperate with the United States on these global challenges like climate and so on, while the United States is disrespecting China's core interests, not abiding by the One China principle and not satisfying us by talking about Xinjiang and complaining about Hong Kong and flirting with the Taiwans and so on. That kind of conditionality and linkage has shifted, and in the last few months, certainly in the last few weeks, we've been hearing from Xi Jinping, his interest and determination in cooperation and working together. There are 1,000 reasons why the U.S.-China relationship should be good and no reasons why it should be fraught and so on. I've also seen on the American side something of an adjustment from, for example, decoupling to de-risking, and from strategic competition to what Jake Sullivan said over the weekend about competitive interdependence, a really interesting formula that is, I think, quite subtle. Now, I think on the U.S. side, some of this is the benefit of experience, fine-tuning, just the way that the Biden administration has been fine-tuning its export control systems and so on. But on the Chinese side, do you also see a big shift in messaging?
Yeah, very much. I mean, it is as you described. If we had two bookends here, one was Secretary of State Tony Blinken's encounter with Yang Jiechi and in Anchorage.
God, don't remind me.
Which was what, about a year in to the new administration?
Barely.
Barely a year.
On, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and here we are 2 years later with the most recent Wang Yi meeting with Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan in Washington a couple of weeks ago. This is kind of chalk and cheese. Is that an Australian expression?
Apparently.
I'm sorry. These are quite different. These represent, I would say, almost polar opposites. So the question which arises analytically is why? So I think on the Chinese side, and remember, I think we've had a discussion on this stage last year, Danny, with Susan Thornton, that book that Susan wrote called Overreach. And
Susan Shirk.
Susan Shirk, don't say Susan Thornton, Susan Shirk. And Susan's concept of overreach I think it was an elegantly phrased book. And I think this permeated into the official class in Beijing, that this is in fact what had happened. That's point number one, and that China was therefore, as a consequence, with several years of wolf warrior diplomacy, losing far too many friends or potential friends around the world. Two, then roll in the real-world economic problem of declining growth that we spoke about before. And therefore, what do we need to fix that? Well, one of the things you need to fix that is to actually bring down the level of geopolitical tension measurably. Not just rhetorically, but measurably. Because international investor houses in this city, New York, but elsewhere in the world, these folks are not dummies. They do their math. They work out what is the real world risk of crisis, conflict and war across the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. They're looking out 5 to 10 years in terms of large-scale foreign direct investment projects and or portfolio investments. And they are making conclusions based on geopolitics. Geopolitical risk is a real factor in the largest investment institutions in the world. So I think in the calculus in China, it's been to reach a conclusion which says, if we wish to help the international factors driving China's better growth performance improve, then we must materially set about doing something to stabilise geopolitics. And so I think that's part of the prism again. We'll see how far that goes in terms of the summit this week. But if your question is what I think is driving all this at a political, diplomatic and national security level and economic level, I think that's what's in the back of the Chinese leadership's mind right now.
Stabilization.
Yeah, and to add one point, given that I'm one of those guys who still reads the People's Daily, and it's an old addiction from the 1980s, when I used to work in our embassy in Beijing, and that's all you had to work out what was going on. But it's the way the system talks to itself. It's the official organ of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. So I noticed a couple of weeks ago, Danny, just the language used in the official commentary describing the upcoming sort of summit between the President and Xi Jinping. And I noticed that the normal formula which China uses for these things, which is that the proper framework for US-China relations is no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect and win-win cooperation. Yeah, and which, if you have that as a phrase and then compare it to the reality of US-China relations, it's kind of like disconnected in its entirety.
Chalk and cheese, I'd say.
Chalk and cheese, thank you. Thank you. You're catching on. Chalk, cheese and Vegemite. And so, but I noticed in this most recent commentary that the language, subtly perhaps, had begun to change. The language began to say something like this, that competition should not be the only factor defining the US-China relationship, that we needed to talk about red lines of a strategic nature, without saying Taiwan, but that was the inference, but there should also be a room for cooperation. So suddenly what I see is sort of a slow crab walk from previous formulations to this new, looser set of formulations by the Chinese side, saying we need to find other framework landing points with the United States, conceptual landing points with the United States, to authorise the system beneath us to have a more adversarial set of engagements with the US as well. So how this turns out later this week, I still can't predict, but I'm just looking for straws in the wind, and there is a few straws there.
Wow, well that is fascinating. That's much more than a straw in the wind, I think. That's pretty powerful. And look, if in fact the Chinese leadership is shifting its position from a pretty rigid, absolutist, competition is an unacceptable framework for the relationship, no, turn around, go back to your side of the Pacific, to an acceptance of the concept that competition is something that is built in, that needs to be managed, and that there are landing points to aim at in the U.S.-China relationship, then that strikes me as pretty promising. I happen to know that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in the past, and the past is not an accurate predictor of the future. Both of them have evolved. Their positions have changed. But when they were vice presidents, they were able to have a genuinely strategic dialogue, delving into what the other perceived in their domestic circumstance, in the international circumstance. So I'm wondering, when we look at the meeting tomorrow, there's 4 hours budgeted. Now, admittedly, this is only the second in-person meeting between the two leaders in the Biden administration. And for an entire year after Bali, it seems like Xi Jinping misplaced his iPhone or Huawei phone because he wouldn't take Joe Biden's call. But nevertheless,
well, the balloon went up and the balloon came down. I think.
Well, there was that.
Yeah.
But it seems like there could be, based on the straws you've plucked out of the wind, a chance for the leaders to have more of a strategic discussion about stabilization. What do you think?
Well, I think both you and I would hope so, but we still don't know so. What I do see, though, is a set of changing interests on China's part, which push it in the direction of how do we stabilize geopolitics. One of the most concrete indicators of that beginning to occur, Danny, as you know, is what happens on the future question of the resumption of military-to-military dialogue between the Chinese and the American armed forces. This has been suspended now for, what, 3 years?
Yes.
Yeah. And so this is really dangerous, just really dangerous. Every time there's an incident, no one's there to pick up the phone. So at a very mechanical level, those of us who follow this closely have been urging our Chinese friends to get these dialogue channels back open again. And not just Secretary of Defense level, but at the operational command level, Indo-PACOM and the rest, because that's where the real live decisions are taken within time frame. As you know from your vast experience, both in the White House and in the State Department as Assistant Secretary, these things happen very quickly. And your ability, therefore, to contain things really hangs on the ability to communicate quickly and to establish a modus vivendi, as opposed to the Chinese side not picking up the phone or taking 3 days to pick up the phone, by which time God knows what has happened. So I think one of the further straws in the wind will be, is this reconvened? That is mill to mill. But the second and equally important in my judgment, Danny, is this. You can say you're re-establishing mill to mill contact, but it has to therefore produce real outcomes, not just crisis avoidance. Things like China's current pattern of routine, almost daily, crossing over the median line in the Taiwan Strait, causing Taiwanese fighter jets to intercept. And each time this happens, we are getting closer to yet a new set of incidents. So it is taking the almost process point of re-establishing dialogue channels between the militaries, but then adding real measures which actually help in the physical deconfliction of both sides. Now, going back to Xi Jinping's economic interests in coming to San Francisco, if the Chinese therefore are able to produce real measures which take the temperature down through acts of deconfliction, guess what? The international investor community will begin to adjust their calculus. If, however, it's a nominal set of measures, like, yeah, we'll pretend to have some mill-mill talks, but it's not going to go anywhere, then the international investor community is not going to respond, because these are deeply pragmatic folks sitting on the top of billions or trillions of dollars, and they've got other places to put it.
Well, there's a world of risks that the two leaders are undoubtedly going to want to discuss. Certainly, Chinese rhetorical and other support for Putin's war against the Ukraine is an important and constant theme in U.S. messaging. No doubt that's going to be reinforced directly. But the new development is the Hamas attack on Israel and the military operation in Gaza and the implications for the Middle East. Do you have a sense of sort of what the U.S. and China might have in terms of common ground there, or how that conversation might unfold?
Yeah, I think on the Middle East, we should perhaps look at it at two levels. One is if there is a common interest, as I would see it, and I'm not a Middle Easternist, by the way, I'm a China guy, so I know what I don't know. And when I get to the Middle East, I sometimes get lost. It's
all the way past Australia and around.
And so I think where a common interest lies is in what both governments were probably saying to Iran right now, which is do not escalate. Any form of horizontal escalation of this conflict is not in either of our interests. From the Chinese lens, why is it not in their interest? Some would say, from a Beijing perspective, the more distracted the United States is on multiple fronts, the better in terms of China's geopolitical interests in the Indo-Pacific. However, China's global interests now are rebuilding its economic growth, and that means taking the global geopolitical temperature down, not just in the Taiwan Straits. And so if you were to have a global conflagration brought about by Iranian direct participation or unleashing the dogs of war through Hezbollah in the north across the Lebanese border, then I think from a Chinese lens, this would be not consistent with core interests. At a different level, I think the Israeli government has had a very clear-eyed opportunity, however, to see where China's international diplomatic support has been through this conflict. And that is, China has, unless you can tell me to the contrary, Danny, not called out Hamas by name.
No, it's pointed its finger at Israel and the U.S.
That's right. It has pointed its finger at the United States. It has not, therefore, acted as a force for restraint in relation to Hamas's activity either within Gaza or in the appalling attack of 7 October. And so this, I think, has brought about a new sense of reality in the Israeli government among the broader political class, not just Likud, but the rest of the political establishment in Jerusalem, that China has deep interests in the global south, which are deeply associated with the Palestinian Authority, deeply associated with that particular cause, and is not about to sacrifice those broader foreign policy interests by calling out Hamas for what it's done on the 7th of October.
Well, I think that, I agree. I think that's, if anything, an understatement, because it certainly looks like the Chinese are taking advantage of this conflict as an opportunity to showcase the U.S. somehow on the wrong side of the equation.
There's a danger for Chinese diplomacy here too, in giving real pause for thought. If you're in Riyadh, if you're in Abu Dhabi, if you're in the Gulf monarchies, looking at how China has responded to this in a manner which is not about, shall we say, problem solving.
Yeah. Well, I've been irresponsible and greedy and just asking you question after question, and I could go on for a long time. I've got a lot more questions, but I owe it to your loyal followers to provide an opportunity to ask a few questions. So if there are questions, and reminder, a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end. Maybe we could take, to begin, 2 questions. We have people on the aisles with mics. I can't see very well if there are any hands up. Yes, I see a gentleman over there, and I see a gentleman over there. So please, quick question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. My question is, what can China realistically offer the West to turn down the temperature in the Indo-Pacific? West is also, American allies and so on. Because I think many would view the situation in Australia as emboldening, that if you don't back down, don't give China what it wants, it will end up conceding. And so therefore, you don't want to negotiate with them until you have more of an advantage.
Got it. Question mark. What can China offer to the West? Yes.
Yes, could you comment on the evolving chip war among China, Taiwan, and Silicon Valley?
Sure. So let's go to what can China offer. And this is just an analytical view. It's not a policy view, because Chinese government haven't extended their briefing papers to me. But I go back to what I said before about the core question of geopolitical stabilization. And that is both a US interest, it's a pan-regional interest, and it's a Chinese interest. So the question is, how can this be brought about in reality, not just by saying we shall have a more stable region, when at the same time all the military assets continue to grow and become more intense in their deployments, and therefore the possibility statistically of collision, crisis, conflict, war, escalation goes accordingly. So building on what I said before, I think concrete things would be for the PLA, People's Liberation Army, to consider returning to its pattern of exercises prior to the Pelosi visit, which is to stay on the west side of the median line in the Taiwan Strait. The more you cross the median line, the more you're going to have Taiwanese aircraft scrambled, and the greater the risk there is of an incident. The second and parallel possibility will come with what happens with the Taiwanese presidential elections in January, where you have Lai Ching-te, who is the candidate for the Democratic Progress Party, and a range of three alternatives from, let's call it, the pan-blue or the conservative spectrum in Taiwanese politics. Let's just say William Lai wins. He's ahead in the polls at the moment, but there are differing interpretations of what might happen between now and January. But if he does, the critical question in terms of geopolitical stability is, what does then China then say and do between that election in January and the presidential inauguration, which happens in May? China's previous pattern has been to ramp up a series of activities, usually by way of military exercises, sometimes coercive economic measures, sometimes a combination of the above. Not doing that, again, contributes materially to stabilization. So that, I think, is something else which could be considered.
Could I jump in to tie your answer back to something that you pointed out earlier on, which is that Xi Jinping is going to be speaking at APEC to the assembled international business community and to American and other CEOs. And I think that there is also risk-related reassurance that could be offered, how credible it is an open question, about things like the anti-espionage law, things like the detention of foreigners in China, things like the prejudicial treatment of Western businesses and so on. And it may be that we will hear things and that they will hear things from Xi Jinping beyond platitudes that help reduce a sense of risk and increase a sense of confidence.
I think on those questions that you just raised, which are material, if you're sitting in a boardroom here in New York, or you're sitting in one in Tokyo, or sitting one in Sydney, or in Europe, and you're trying to work out, are my staff going to be safe in China, given the pattern of arrests which has happened in recent times? Knowing a little bit about Chinese politics, I think it's unlikely that Xi Jinping will stand up before the APEC audience and say, well, we overreached on all of that. Sorry about that. We'll ratchet it all back. I don't think
CIA spies can come back.
So, knowing a little bit about how Chinese politics works, I don't think that's going to happen. But what would be interesting to watch on the ground is whether operationally anything changes by way of the real pattern of activity. The law is one thing, the operationalization of it is another, and the securitization of everything is the overarching frame here. But for material behaviours to change on the ground. But in terms of the APEC audience question, before I go back to chips, I go back to what I was saying before in answer to the young man's question over here, which is at the end of the day, the core question in the minds of business at home and abroad are twofold. One, how do we get business and consumer confidence rebuilt and restored domestically within China? And if you can't do that, two, how do you give us genuine geopolitical assurance that we're not within ready reach of a full-blown crisis across the Taiwan Straits? So therefore, when he's speaking to 1,000 corporates, however many they're going to be in San Francisco, dealing with the reality of those two things, and on the second, which is the geopolitical risk factor, it'll be not just, in my judgment, saying it's good that Mill is back, it is going beyond it in the direction that we were talking about before. Of course, he would not be that explicit in such a speech about what those concrete measures might be, but it's the materiality of bringing down geopolitical risk which will cause boardrooms to say things have changed. Mm-hmm. You can't just get a bit of fairy dust and going, well, geopolitical risk is gone, all problem solved. It just doesn't work like that. Just quickly on chips, I think on chip competition, beyond my pay grade, to give you a detailed technical analysis of where the relative standing of competitiveness lies between TSMC, other chips manufacturers around the world, the United States and the PRC, other than to say that my overall analysis, looking at the published reports from people in the field like Eric Schmidt, is that by and large, the United States and its allies still remain significantly ahead in this overall race in chips in terms of their size, their computing power, and therefore their energy consumption in producing a given unit of computing power. I think China is discovering the limits to its own national industrial policy, that you can't just, again, apply the fairy dust of $1 trillion worth of investment and produce a chip which is at 3 as opposed to 7 on the bandwidth and of its efficiency.
大家好，欢迎大家收看六度百科节目。本期节目内容如下：美国人为什么喜欢吃汉堡？美国人为什么喜欢吃汉堡？信息与背景。各位亲爱的听众，我们今天要探讨的问题是：美国人为什么喜欢吃汉堡？首先，我们得承认，汉堡对于美国人来说，不仅仅是一种食物，它更像是一种文化象征。在美国，汉堡代表了快速、便利和经济实惠，这与美国的快节奏生活方式相吻合。你可以在路边的快餐车买到，也可以在5星级餐厅享用到精致的汉堡。 汉堡的多元化和普及性，让它成为了美国人日常生活中不可或缺的一部分。其次，汉堡的组成部分也是美国人喜欢它的原因之一。一个标准的汉堡包含了肉饼、面包、生菜、番茄和酱汁等，这些食材的组合既美味又营养均衡。而且，汉堡的做法十分灵活，你可以根据自己的口味添加各种配料，如芝士、培根、洋葱等，这种可以自定义的特性，使得汉堡更具吸引力。最后，我们还不能忽略汉堡的社会影响。在美国，汉堡被视为一种民主的象征，因为无论你是富人还是穷人，都可以享受到同样美味的汉堡。而且，汉堡的价格也相对较低，使得它成为了普通人可以负担的美食。总的来说，美国人喜欢吃汉堡，是因为它既美味又便利，更重要的是，它代表了美国的文化和价值观。就像一位美国作家所说的那样，汉堡就像自由，一旦尝到，就再也不能放弃。那么，下次当你看到一个美国人正在享受他的汉堡时，不妨想想，他可能不只是在吃一顿饭，而是在享受一种文化、一种生活方式，甚至一种信念。美国人为什么喜欢吃汉堡？重要人物和事件。各位，今天我们要来谈一个美国文化的重要符号——汉堡。你可能会问，为什么美国人这么喜欢吃汉堡？这个问题其实是深深植根于美国的历史和文化中的。首先，让我们回到19世纪末的美国。当时，美国正处于工业革命的高峰期，大量的移民涌入美国寻找工作机会。这些工人需要快速、便宜、能够带走的食物，而汉堡恰好符合这些需求。当时的汉堡就像今天的快餐，为工人提供了方便的营养来源。然后，我们要提到一个重要的人物，他就是汉堡之父路易斯·拉塞尔。1904年，他在密苏里州的圣路易斯世界博览会上首次将汉堡介绍给大众。他的创新之处在于将肉饼放在两片面包之间，这让人们可以用手拿着吃，不需要刀叉，非常方便。进入20世纪，随着汽车的普及，汉堡也进化成为开车点餐的代表食物。1950年代，雷克罗克创立了麦当劳，将汉堡的快餐模式推广到全球，使汉堡成为美国文化的象征。那么，为什么美国人喜欢吃汉堡呢？我们可以从3个方面来看。第一，汉堡的出现符合了工业化社会的需求，提供了快速、便宜、方便的饮食选择。第二，汉堡的创新形式使其成为了一种新的饮食文化，吸引了大众的注意。第三，汉堡的全球化使其成为了美国文化的代表，引起了美国人的自豪感。总的来说，美国人喜欢吃汉堡，不只是因为它好吃，更是因为它是美国文化的一部分。就像我们喜欢吃面包，不只是因为它好吃，而是因为它是我们生活的一部分。那么，下次当你吃汉堡的时候，不妨想想，你不只是在吃一个汉堡，你其实是在品尝一种文化。这就是为什么美国人喜欢吃汉堡的原因。美国人为什么喜欢吃汉堡？影响。美国人为何热爱吃汉堡？这其实是一个深奥而富有哲学意味的问题。在此，我将以一种兼具专业、幽默和智慧的方式，试图解释这个问题。首先，我们得承认，汉堡的美味程度就如同一位好莱坞明星的吸引力，无人能抵挡。汉堡的每一个元素都像是一位导演精心编排的剧本，吸引着观众的目光。它的面包像是一个舞台，肉饼则是主角，生菜、番茄、洋葱和酱料则是配角，它们共同创造出一部美味的大片。其次，汉堡可说是美国的国民象征，就像老鹰、棒球和自由女神像一样，它象征着美国人的快节奏生活和实用主义精神。当你手中拿着一个汉堡，你就有了一餐饱足的感觉，而且它还可以在行走中食用，完全符合美国人快速、效率的生活方式。再者，汉堡的多样性也是美国人喜爱它的原因。你可以根据自己的口味来选择汉堡的配料，无论你是素食主义者还是肉食动物，都可以在汉堡的世界中找到你的位置。这种多元化的选择正好反映出美国的多元文化。最后，我们不能忽略汉堡的社会影响力。汉堡不仅仅是一种食物，它更是一种文化现象，它影响着美国人的饮食习惯、生活方式， 甚至是他们的思维方式。从这个角度来看，美国人喜欢吃汉堡，其实是他们在享受自己的文化。总的来说，美国人喜欢吃汉堡，是因为汉堡美味、方便、多样化，并且与他们的生活方式和文化密切相关。就像我们爱我们的家人和朋友一样，美国人爱汉堡，是因为汉堡是他们的一部分。汉堡在美国饮食文化中的历史起源是什么？各位，让我们一起回到那个满是马车、牛仔和黄金热的19世纪美国。当时的美国人，尤其是那些在西部开荒的勇士们，需要一种能够快速摄取能量、易于携带且不需要刀叉的食物。于是，汉堡这种来自德国的美食，就在这样的需求下，被美国人引进并进行了一些创新。这个故事的主角，汉堡，其名字源自德国的汉堡市，这里曾经有一种名为 Hamburg Steak 的食物，是用碎牛肉做成的，但它并不像现在我们所认知的汉堡那样夹在面包中间，而是作为一种快速营养的食物供给给那些正在寻找新生活的移民。当这些移民抵达美国后，他们带着这个食谱，并将它改良成我们今天所熟知的汉堡。碎牛肉被烹调成肉饼，然后放在2片面包中间，这样就可以一手握着，一边行走一边吃，非常适合忙碌的美国生活节奏。汉堡的普及要归功于20世纪初的快餐业的发展，尤其是当麦当劳在1940年开业后，他们将汉堡作为主打产品，并且通过流水线式的生产方式，使得汉堡能够快速大量的制作出来，满足了美国人快节奏生活的需求。所以我们可以说，汉堡在美国饮食文化中的历史起源，其实是一个从德国移民到美国，然后通过创新和商业化，最终成为美国饮食的代表之一的故事。而这个故事也正是美国的一个缩影，一个充满创新、包容和商业精神的国家。现在，当我们提到美国，我们可能会想到自由女神像、好莱坞，还有就是那个满是番茄酱、芝士、酸黄瓜，让人垂涎3尺的汉堡。这就是汉堡在美国饮食文化中的历史起源，也是其在全球饮食文化中的影响力。那么，谁想要来一个汉堡呢？汉堡是如何在美国的文化中扮演角色的？先生们、女士们，大家好，我是六博士。今天我们要来谈谈美国文化中的一个重要角色——汉堡。不，我不是在说汉堡市长或是汉堡警察，我们要谈的是那种美味、诱人、让人垂涎3尺的汉堡。汉堡在美国文化中的角色，大约可以比喻为一个全能运动员，无论是在经济、社会，甚至是心理层面，都能看到他的身影。首先，汉堡在美国经济中扮演的角色，就如同一个不可或缺的推动者。从快餐业的崛起到大型连锁餐厅的扩张，汉堡都是其中的重要角色。它不仅创造了大量的就业机会，也带动了相关产业的发展，例如肉品加工、面包制造等。在社会层面，汉堡则如同一位社交达人，它跨越了种族、性别、年龄和经济地位的隔阂，成为了人们共享的美食。无论是在家庭聚会、朋友聚餐，甚至是商业会议中，汉堡都能见到它的身影。它不仅满足了人们的口腹之欲，也成为了人们社交的一部分。在心理层面，汉堡则像一位心理治疗师，它满足了人们对于快速、方便、美味的需求，同时也缓解了人们的压力。当你疲惫、沮丧、焦虑时，一个美味的汉堡就像一位懂你的朋友，他不会质问你，只会默默地陪在你身边。总的来说，汉堡在美国文化中的角色就像一个全能的超级英雄，它不仅推动了经济的发展，也桥接了社会的隔阂，更是人们心灵的慰藉。所以，下次当你吃到汉堡时，不妨想想它在美国文化中的角色，或许你会对这个美味的汉堡有更深的认识。汉堡之所以受欢迎，是否与其味觉和方便性有关？当然，汉堡之所以受到全球食客的热烈欢迎，其原因就如同它的组成一样，既有层次又有深度。首先，我们要谈论的是味觉。汉堡是一种美食多元合一的大熔炉，它将各种味道融合在一起，创造出一种独特的风味。面包、肉饼、蔬菜、酱料，每一层都有其独特的口感和味道，组合在一起，就像一支完美的交响乐团，每个乐器都在演奏着自己的部分，但又和谐地融合在一起，创造出美妙的音乐。 这就是汉堡的味觉魅力。再者，方便性也是汉堡受欢迎的重要因素。在快节奏的现代生活中，时间就是金钱，而汉堡就如同一个美味的时间管理师。你可以在走路、开车，甚至是办公的时候吃汉堡，它不需要餐具，也不需要繁复的饮食礼节，只需要一只手就能轻松享用。而且，汉堡的制作过程也非常快速，从点餐到出餐，短短几分钟就能完成，这对于那些总是在赶时间的人来说，无疑是一大福音。然而，我们不能忽视的是，汉堡的受欢迎也有一部分原因是因为它的普遍性和多样性。无论你在世界的哪个角落，都能找到汉堡，而且每个地方都有其独特的汉堡风味。这种多样性使得汉堡能够满足不同人的口味需求，也使得人们对汉堡始终保持着新鲜感。所以，我们可以说，汉堡之所以受欢迎，是因为它成功的将味觉的丰富性、生活的方便性和文化的多样性完美的融合在一起，创造出一种全球食客都难以抵抗的魅力。就像我们都知道，汉堡可能不是最健康的食物，但谁能抵挡住它的美味和便利呢？就像一个有趣的笑话，可能不会让你变得更聪明，但它能让你的生活更加快乐。请介绍几款特别有名有特色的汉堡。在这个饱含美食的世界，汉堡无疑是其中的一个亮点。我们可以说，汉堡是美食界的流行歌手，在全球各地都有无数的粉丝。今天，我将介绍几款特别有名有特色的汉堡，它们就像是汉堡界的巨星，带着独特的风格和魅力，吸引着全球的食客。麦当劳的 Big Mac， 这是一款全球知名的汉堡，也可以说是汉堡界的流行歌手。它的特色是有2层牛肉饼，中间夹住一片面包，上面还有生菜、芝士、酱汁等配料，吃起来口感丰富，是麦当劳的代表作。2伯肯的 Whopper， 这款汉堡可以说是摇滚明星，因为它的大小和味道都很抢眼。一个大大的牛肉饼，上面还有洋葱、生菜、番茄、酱汁等配料，吃起来既有肉的香味，又有蔬菜的清爽。3 Out 的 Double Double， 这款汉堡是美国西海岸的特色，可以说是汉堡界的独立音乐人。它的特色是有2层牛肉饼和2片芝士，再配上新鲜的蔬菜和特制的酱汁，吃起来既美味又健康。4 Shake Shack 的 Shack Burger， 这款汉堡是纽约的特色，可以说是汉堡界的爵士乐手。它的特色是牛肉饼上面有一层融化的芝士，再配上新鲜的蔬菜和特制的酱汁，吃起来既丰富又浓郁。这4款汉堡各有特色，就像是汉堡界的巨星一样，各有各的风格和魅力。所以，无论你是喜欢流行歌手还是摇滚明星，或者是独立音乐人和爵士乐手，在汉堡界，你都能找到自己的最爱。吃汉堡需要注意什么？吃汉堡，这是一门深奥的学问，需要我们用专业、幽默和智慧的语言来探讨。首先，我们需要明确一点，吃汉堡并不是一种简单的行为，而是一种艺术，一种享受，一种对生活的热爱。首先，选择汉堡的时候，我们需要注意其内容物的均衡。一个好的汉堡应该包含肉、面包、蔬菜等多种营养元素。如果你的汉堡只有肉，那你可能需要考虑一下你的饮食习惯是否健康。如果你的汉堡只有蔬菜，那你可能需要考虑一下你是否在做素食主义者。其次，吃汉堡的时候，我们需要注意其大小。一个好的汉堡应该是你能够一口咬下的大小。如果你的汉堡太大，那你可能需要考虑一下你的咬合力是否足够。如果你的汉堡太小，那你可能需要考虑一下你是否在节食。再次，吃汉堡的时候，我们需要注意其口感。一个好的汉堡应该是面包柔软，肉汁丰富，蔬菜爽脆。如果你的汉堡面包硬，肉干，蔬菜软，那你可能需要考虑一下你的烹饪技巧是否到位。最后，吃汉堡的时候，我们需要注意其风味。一个好的汉堡应该是咸甜适中，香气四溢。如果你的汉堡咸、甜、香气不足，那你可能需要考虑一下你的调味技巧是否合适。总的来说，吃汉堡需要注意的事情很多，但是只要你遵循以上的原则，我相信你可以享受到吃汉堡的乐趣。毕竟，汉堡不仅仅是一种食物，更是一种生活方式，一种对美好生活的追求。谢谢您收看6度百科，这是由一群科学家 经济学家、专业媒体人、工程技术人员合作制作的百科类节目。这些内容并不一定反映六度百科团队的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度百科内容涉及诸多知识领域，我们努力使其内容真实、专业，不存在预设立场。如果受众发现内容有误，赞同或反对六度百科内容，请在我们的节目留言区发表您的高见。欢迎大家到六度世界 六度 World 阅读我们的更多内容，参与六度聊天区的讨论。请订阅我们的频道，给我们